Dr. Incera also showed us. And now Mr. Carlos Castro Correa, well, comes from the President's office. Very important efforts are being carried out in this regard. Mr. Carlos Castro Correa is Director of Open Data Analysis, of the Coordination of National Digital Strategy of the President's Office. He studied applied mathematics at ITAM between 2007 and 12. He has broad experience in analysis of data and statistics. He has worked in AXA Insurance as a senior actuary and risk management. He's a consultant on health, government, and industrial risk management, as well as on Mexico's C4 to do a statistical sampling to determine the best location for CCTV cameras around the city based on crime incidents. Mr. Carlos Castro Correa will be discussing populational displacement and natural disasters, data analysis, cell phone antennas, and big data during the floods in Tabasco in 2009. Well, before anything else, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank Dr. Fernando Leiva. And before we discuss the floods in Tabasco in 2009 and the surveys we carried out, I would like to discuss the coordination I work at and the work we are carrying out there. First of all, our office was in charge of implementing for the first time a national policy of open data in Mexico. And it is very important because I did not include this topic until I heard the first presentations that said that open data was an important input. But not everybody knows what open data is, so I will take a minute or two to explain it. Open data is the information available to the government, information that might be public, but that it is also in certain formats that make it possible for that information to be used by any individual. The first feature is that this is available to all, open data, and information is not charged for. There are no barriers to use it. These are preferably online and free of charge, as well as an open and readable format. And that is maybe more common for people that work on data analysis. Even though we have seen that there are public information that might be available on PDF formats, these PDFs need to be transformed or converted to formats that can be analyzed. So the open data form proposal is to use free formats that contain no symbols that could make us lose time instead of finding actual useful information. Another feature is that these are openly licensed. Usually these are in a CSV format, and these need to be primary and timely. It wouldn't be worthwhile to have public information that is not relevant for anybody. So then, how do we begin with this process? This process started around 8 months ago with the data opening process. Alongside this process, the national open data policy was being carried out. This website, data.gov.mx, in which in a couple of months you will be able to have access to the databases that are already published. We carried out a survey measuring subject preferences throughout the country and for data users. The idea is that all the information needs to be public and open, but we have to begin somewhere. So we divided most common interest topics, and we worked on a survey that was open online. Everybody could have access to it. However, there is a certain degree of bias. There is not sufficient variance for a survey. However, it was helpful. We registered 9,000 different users and we received 60,000 different responses, and we found out that the topics that were most interesting were democracy and accountability, economy, finance, and education. We have to consider that the discussion about the tax reform was was in vogue. It was being commented a lot. This shows why it might have been considered so interesting. And these are the preferences this survey produced. This showed that the bases that had to be open first and the projects that would have to accompany this effort. This is the website. The open data policy is still available if you are willing to read it. This policy was open around 6 weeks, during which anybody could leave a comment or give a suggestion. And the people in charge of the policy have been including all these comments on different sections, privacy, users' data, personal data. And this enabled us to present the policy under a different light, because before it was made official, it was published online. And we first asked the opinion of the people, of the actual data users. And now I'm going to discuss an initiative. There are several initiatives that go along the national open data policy, because we think it is not only about publishing information and letting it be. We know that there are different levels of data users, people that can download information and that can do statistics or perform the techniques that were just being discussed. And there are also people that are not so interested about the technical side of this, but that still want to look at data. This will discuss other initiatives, but this is called the Data for Development. So what we wanted to do was to analyze population dynamics in 2009 in the state of Tabasco. And we did this alongside the Global Pulse, which is the data analysis and big data lab of the UN, using information from the General Directorate of Civil Protection, with the INEGI, with the Commission of Water, as well as the National Disaster Prevention Center. And now I will explain what this structure is. Global Pulse is actually the intermediary between information sources. In this case, a data donor, that in this case was data about telephone consumption, and the office of the presidency on the other side. And we wanted to study Tabasco's floods in 2009, specifically on October the 28th. The cold front number 9 entered the national territory, and 3 days later it arrived to the coasts of the state of Tabasco. According to the information of the National Meteorology Service, more than 4 times the expected rainfall for that period was received. This is a map of the accumulated precipitation around the state of Tabasco. The data are regarding the location of cell phone towers, latitude, longitude, and the coverage of every one of these towers. The antenna that provides coverage for every cell phone area was determined based on the geographical position of every user. It is important to specify two aspects. Anonymized information were always in the possession of Global Pulse, the UN agency that worked as an intermediary to process information, and on our side, we actually performed the analysis of the government's information as well as research questions. So the data were always there, already anonymized by Global Pulse. And still, this information was useful for us to detect displacements after, well, population displacements after a flood takes place. There are other pieces of data, such as satellite images. All resources besides private and open data also required satellite data information about precipitation, and also civil protection data that were telling us where the shelters, where the temporary shelters were, and who were the affected population. The population census of 2010 helped us to evaluate the significance of data about the cell phone consumptions in that area, geographic information systems such as hydrographic networks and roads, and there are other sources of information such as that coming from magazines, newspapers. Good practice in a study or a research such as this is to establish research lines or the actual questions we wanted to answer. We wanted to understand the social dynamics during a natural disaster and if it was at all relevant with behavior uh, with the behavior on the calls that were being made. We also wanted to know if information from cell phone towers could help us to improve our response to a new natural disaster and also to find out how much this information contrasts with the official records that the Ministry of the Interior of Civil Protection have, as well as what are the usual communication patterns in the region. There are several problems that arise during an emergency, as you might very well know. For example, when a state of disaster is declared on an area, the Fund for Natural Disasters is triggered and they are given resources to reconstruct infrastructure. However, there are many problems with this. There's problems with the lack of information, with the lack of proper supply of resources. There are not good logistics to send the supplies to the damaged population, and some of the communication routes might be obstructed or destroyed. The methodology was first on this graph we presented on axis Y the population per municipality in Tabasco according to the INEGI census that took place in 2010. And on the right side, we have cell phone users in these same municipalities. The only thing we did here was just a regression, and the value of R square just told us that the data was not that was actually accurate. It was not so far-fetched to start analyzing this using cell phone towers. This was the first comparison we did with official data. And another important aspect is that we defined the main antenna of every cell phone number depending on the antenna to whom most users made calls to during the nighttime, because we were working under the assumption that the people would actually call, that are using the cell phones at night are probably calling from home. We also allocated the main antenna to the main to every number, and we did a Voronoi type of partition to find out what were the closest towers. This is not the real data. This is just an image of a Voronoi partition, and every red dot is closer to that antenna than to any other, and that was how we assigned the main antenna to every cell phone number. This is another way in which we can represent the same information. In green, we have INEGI data, population per municipality, and in pink, we can see the users of cell phone towers. On the left, we have the same graph, but showing the populational variable per color. In red, we find the people that the areas that have a higher population.
And we define the metric of variation, which is nothing but a normalization of calls. XC is the number of calls for each day per each hour, in a cell phone tower. And we subtract the mean and the variance. This is quite common in the insurance industry for early alerts when frequency is very high or severity is high. These alerts tell you need to focus on a city, on an area. This was used just to normalize the time, and the deviations are going to help us detect a typical activity in cell phone towers. The variation tower, has two events that normally are consumed, for instance, during Christmas, and how this compares to the activity in Christmas and during the flood, and periods before and after that show how the flood or the activities in cell phone towers is a different way to see or analyze the flood. And as part of the context, I can say that the variation metrics were done from June to April the next year. This is a visualization of the displacement that occurred during the nighttime of a flood. On the left, we can see a period of time within the emergency. We can see how everything flared up, and a random period where you can see that displacements are much reduced. Um, red, red, you have people leaving, and yellow is people being displaced from one area to another. I don't know if you have a video. No, I put a video on this. This is an alternative way of seeing how activity changed. On the left, you have the municipalities most affected. You can see the variations, and we put the natural natural disaster period, and then Christmas. You can see how it behaves during 6 months in the region. Christmas is all of it, not just one part. And well, that was just an example. The next slide. This is the same information as I was saying. Municipalities of Cárdenas and Huimanguillo, which are on the left, closer to Veracruz, were the ones most affected, and they matched with the areas with greatest change in activities. We can see a river here. Everything in blue is rivers and lakes. That's important. I'll tell you why. This helped us understand two things. One had to do with the distance. We saw that 70% of the users had moved less than 10 kilometers from their main antenna, and that 3% had to move more than 100 kilometers. That can be explained because sometimes when a flood arrives at a place, people prefer to go to another state or someone who lives very far away, but there are people who respond well to temporary housing or well, time is also important. Most of the people affected, 70%, took less than 1 week to return home, and 7% took more than 1 month. This is useful because sometimes we need to quantify the resources used and that we need to send, and sometimes we don't know where to send it, how much. So this time distribution allows us to determine this. And something very important, the highest variation was in Road 180, but there's something curious about this. Here, well, it was not flooded and it had plenty of activity and a huge change of metrics. So this graph corresponds to 6 different antennae. I'll tell you where, and it is graphed by time. In blue is the rain, and red the variation metrics, but in general it's 4 days between the highest level of precipitation and the highest variation in antennas. And well, we continued to study why, and we saw that it had to do with the fact that there was a delay between the emergency and cell activity. So when it starts raining, water begins to accumulate. So civil protection sent an alert 3 days before, but people didn't pay attention. So 3 days it rained less, rivers and dams filled up. They broke, and that's why after 4 days people tried to escape, and that's why we explain these changes. A and B match with the places on the far left, which are the most affected ones. And what is this for? The effectiveness of civil protection alerts. Well, there's skepticism in the sense that we might not be using the right systems. We propose a different alternative and different methodology that can help detect areas that require additional backup and help us understand how much and why people are displaced. It helps us identify the location of the shelters, average time, and how the government is responding to an emergency of this nature. Thank you very much.